She was 20 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. The letter from her uncle's solicitor had arrived on a Tuesday, 3 sentences long,
like this,
informing her that her services and her presence at the Thorne and Company counting house in Boston were no longer required as of the end of the month.
there is nothing more.
In the pocket of her traveling coat, wrapped in a square of oiled sailcloth, was her father's brass sighting compass, its glass scratched, its needle still true. The only thing she had carried out of the harbor cottage the day he did not come home. With $387 to her name and a folded handbill she had pulled from a chandler's notice board. She had bought a deed to a place she had never seen for the sum of $412, and what nobody knew, not the solicitor, not her uncle. Not the sunburned clerk who had stamped the transfer. Was that she had been reading her father's whaling logs and mechanical schematics in secret for 11 years and understood the tripods and the winches and the cooperage of a shore station better than any living man within 500 miles of the place she was about to inherit. So pour yourself something warm, settle in, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Because this is the story of Miss Adelaide Merrick and the derelict whaling station at Halbert's Reach, and of the small brass compass that pointed her, in the summer of 1897, toward a life she had not dared to imagine. Her father, Elias Merrick, had smelled of tarred rope and cold iron and the faint sweetness of whale oil that never quite washed out of a cooper's apron, and his hands, broad and calloused and marked with a dozen small crescent scars from the draw knife, had guided hers over the curve of a barrel stave when she was 7 years old, teaching her that a cask was not a container but an argument between wood and water that the cooper had to settle fairly. He had been a shore station cooper and, later, a mechanic of tripods and try-works. One of those rare men who understood both the coopering of the oil barrels and the iron plumbing of the rendering furnaces. And he had taught her to read a schematic the way other fathers taught their daughters to read a hymnal. When she was 9, a snapped mooring line took him across the deck of a bark in Nantucket Sound and into the water between the hull and the pilings. And the men who pulled him out an hour later brought back only the compass in his pocket and a piece of parting wisdom he had once given her over supper, a machine, Addie, is only ever as honest as the hands that keep it. Her mother, Hannah, whom she remembered chiefly as the scent of bergamot and beeswax and the cool touch of a palm on her forehead during a fever, had followed him within the year, taken quietly by a lung fever that never announced itself with any drama, and Adelaide had been sent to Boston to live with her father's elder brother Josiah, a man who kept a counting house on State Street and regarded his niece as a line item requiring depreciation. In Josiah Thorne's world, a world he sometimes called, without irony, the ledger book of profit and loss, a girl was an expense that ideally converted into a marriage or a wage, and Adelaide became. At 11, his junior clerk, learning double-entry bookkeeping at a standing desk and mastering the elegant, punishing arithmetic of interest and freight and marine insurance. She was quick and quiet and never made an error twice, and her uncle mistook her competence for contentment. What he did not see, because he never once climbed to the small attic room above the kitchen where she slept, was the trunk beneath her cot containing her father's leather-bound schematics, his coopering manuals, and a bundle of letters from a Mr. Halvert of Halbert's Reach, Oregon, dated between 1878 and 1881. In which her father and this distant correspondent had discussed the design of a gravity-fed try-works and the proper seasoning of white oak for oil casks in a coastal climate. She read them by candle stub, some nights until 2 in the morning, and the elegant logic of a machine became, for her, a private country to which her uncle's ledger held no visa. The dismissal itself came in April of 1897, on a bright cold morning, and it was not, in fairness, an act of cruelty. It was simply the cold calculus of a merger. Thorne and Company was absorbing the small brokerage of a Mr. Prendergast, whose son-in-law required a clerkship, and there was no room in the reorganized firm for a niece whose usefulness had always been slightly awkward to explain to visitors. Uncle Josiah delivered the news standing behind his walnut desk, one hand resting on the closed brass inkwell, his eyes fixed somewhere just to the left of her ear, and he did not invite her to sit. Adelaide, he said, in the tone he used for tenants 3 months in arrears, the arrangement we have had is no longer practicable. I have written a character reference. I have also, in consideration of your father, prepared a settlement of $400, which I believe to be generous under the circumstances. You will need to be out of the attic room by Friday. She did not plead. She folded her hands at her waist and said, "Thank you, uncle. I will be ready by Thursday." Upstairs, she packed into a single carpetbag, 2 shirtwaists, 1 heavy skirt, her father's schematics wrapped in oilcloth, a tin of nib pens, the leather bundle of Halvard letters, and, in her coat pocket, the brass sighting compass in its square of sailcloth. On the mantel in the parlor stood a silver-framed photograph of Uncle Josiah's own children at a picnic in Brookline, and beside it, where her father's portrait had once briefly stood upon her arrival 11 years before, there was now a small Chinese vase, and she understood that this vase had been standing there for some time. She closed the front door of the house on Beacon Hill so softly that the brass knocker did not stir, and the compass rode against her ribs as she walked to the depot. Its weight the only reassurance she required. The train west took 11 days with 3 changes, and by the 4th day her mouth tasted of coal dust and her back had learned the shape of a slatted second-class bench. And the strangers on either side of her, a Swedish farmer, an itinerant photographer with a case of glass plates, a woman traveling with a caged canary, had all, one by one, gotten off at towns whose names she forgot before the whistle blew. She watched the country flatten and rise and flatten again, and she repeated to herself, in the cadence her father had used when a barrel failed a water test, that one cannot truly lose what one never possessed, and Boston, she realized somewhere near the Missouri, had never really been hers to lose. The handbill she had found tacked to the chandler's notice board on Long Wharf, half hidden beneath a bill for a lost dog, had read in large soot-black type, by order of the county of Tillamook, Oregon, property sale, the Halvard Shore Whaling Station, known locally as Halvard's Reach, back taxes of $412, no reserve. She had recognized the name from her father's letters before she had recognized what she meant to do about it, and by the time she boarded the westbound at South Station she had already done it. Halvard's Reach, when the mail coach set her down in it on the 12th day, was a sun-bleached strip of 23 buildings pressed between a gray Pacific and a green wall of Sitka spruce. And it was defined, as her father's letters had prepared her to expect, by an absence. The whales had not come in commercial numbers for 9 seasons, the shore station had closed in 1889. And the small river that gave the town its water ran through a bed that was 2/3 gravel and 1/3 memory. But the thing that stopped her breath at the top of the coach road was neither the town nor the sea, it was the whaling station itself, 3/4 of a mile down the Strand. A great weathered timber colossus of a building the length of 2 Boston row houses set end to end, with a slate-roofed rendering house, a squat brick tryworks chimney, a cooperage wing, and, running out into the surf on barnacled pilings, a flensing pier long enough to accommodate a bowhead. It was absurd, magnificent, utterly abandoned, its windows blind with salt, its great south doors sagging, and Adelaide Merrick, standing on the coach road with her carpetbag at her feet, understood at once that she was looking at a forgotten ledger entry, a thing written down and then quietly struck through, and that this made it, for better or worse, kin. The county clerk was a thin, sun-cured man named Mr. Folly, who occupied a single room above the feed store, and when she stated her business he looked at her for a long moment over the top of his spectacles and then laughed, not unkindly. "Miss," he said, "we call that building the Halvard Folly. The whales are gone, the old man's gone, and the salt has been at it for 8 winters. You are welcome to it for the back taxes, which stand at $412 exactly. But I would be failing in my Christian duty if I did not point out that you could purchase a serviceable dry goods store in La Grande for that sum. And it would not leak." She set the carpetbag on his desk, opened the inner pocket, and counted out $400 in $10 national bank notes, 1 $10 gold eagle, and 2 silver dollars, arranging them in 3 neat stacks. Mr. Police shrugged, muttered, "Well, God keep you then, Miss Merrick," and drew the deed from a wooden tray. He filled in her name in a slow copperplate hand, sanded the ink, pressed a red wax seal beside the county's stamp, and slid the brittle, decal-edged paper across to her. She had, in that moment, $3.40 remaining in the world, a deed to 11,000 square feet of rotting timber, and a compass in her pocket, and she felt, for the first time since the letter on the walnut desk, entirely herself. The great south doors of the station opened with a groan that seemed to come from the building's chest rather than its hinges, and the dust inside was thick as a blanket. A fine grey felt of neglect that lay upon the flensing tables and the tripod rims and the coopering benches and rose in slow columns where the afternoon light came slanting through the salt blind windows. She walked the length of it, 92 paces from south doors to north, her boots printing a dark trail behind her. She counted 11 rooms in the rendering house, a loft above the cooperage with a working block and tackle, a bunk room with 8 iron cots, a kitchen with a cast iron range the size of a small carriage, and, at the very heart of the structure, the try-works, 2 great iron rendering pots set into a brick furnace. Their bellies pitted but unbroken, their chimneys sound. She rapped her knuckles against the nearer pot and it answered with the deep clean note her father had taught her to listen for, and she said aloud, to no one, in the language he had used, "Fundamentally sound." The words carried in the empty hull. She stood a long moment with her palm flat against the cold iron and understood the building not as a ruin but as a home waiting to be awakened. She chose the small cooper's office off the north end of the workshop as her first habitable corner because it had a working stove, a single glazed window, and a door that latched. And she set about the place in the methodical way her father had once set about a leaking cask. On day 1 she swept, on day 2 she washed the window with vinegar and rainwater until the light came through blue and clean, on day 3 she pulled the old straw from the mattress on the cot, burned it in the yard, and stuffed the ticking with fresh dry bracken. She patched a hand-sized hole in the roof of the cooper's office with a scrap of tarred canvas and 3 shingles pried from a fallen shed. She rationed her flour and her salt pork and her small tin of coffee against the $4 of provisions she had bought on credit at the general store. And she measured her water from the spring behind the station in a copper dipper, 1 quart in the morning and 1 quart at night. On the 7th evening she lit her first fire in the small office stove with driftwood she had gathered herself, boiled a pot of coffee, ate a piece of ship's biscuit softened in it, and sat on the cot in a small pocket of civilization in a building full of dust, and she was, quite unreasonably, happy. There was one door she could not open. It stood at the top of a narrow stair off the cooperage loft, a heavy oak door with a black iron lock and no keyhole she could persuade with the bent hairpin her father had taught her, on rainy Nantucket afternoons, to use on the pantry latch. She worked at that lock for the better part of an evening, kneeling on the plank landing with the compass beside her on the wood, and she failed. The lock was of a pattern she did not know, a warded thing with a false gate, and her hairpin skittered and slid and finally snapped. She sat back on her heels, blew the hair out of her eyes, and considered the door as a machine rather than as an obstacle. Then she went down to the cooperage, took a long-handled screwdriver and a pry bar from her father's kind of tool rack, climbed back up, and set to work on the hinges instead. It took her 4 hours and cost her the skin off 2 knuckles on her right hand, but at 10:30 at night, by the light of a whale oil lamp she had filled from a dusty jug in the try-works, the great oak door tilted forward on its ruined pins and she caught it against her shoulder and lowered it to the floor. The air that came out of the room smelled of old paper and cold iron and something faintly, sweetly medicinal, like camphor left too long in a drawer. It was an office, the master's office of the station, and it had been closed, she guessed, on a single afternoon 8 winters ago and had waited for her ever since. A great oak desk stood beneath the window. A leather-backed captain's chair was pushed neatly against it, on the desk lay a bone-handled pen, a bottle of ink dried to a black disc, a pipe in a brass tray, and a large canvas-bound logbook. Against the far wall stood a glass-fronted cabinet containing 3 ledgers, a sextant, a small daguerreotype of a woman and 2 children, and a folded wool coat on a peg beside the door as though its owner had merely stepped out to see about the tide. She sat down in the captain's chair as if she had every right to it, which, she reminded herself, she now did, and she opened the logbook. The hand was small and clipped and steady, and it belonged, the first page told her, to Captain Nils Halvard, proprietor of the Halvard Shore Station. And its entries ran from March 1878 to November 1889, 11 years and 8 months of tides and takes and coopering counts and weather. She read at random, then from the end. October 17, 1889. No whales this month. Crew reduced to 4. Cannery at Astoria will not renew the oil contract. November 3, 1889. Ingrid's grave visited. Snow on the headland. The boy's stone almost illegible now. November 9, 1889. Paid off the last of the crew. Gave Sven the good axe. The station is quiet as a church. November 22, 1889. If any soul finds this book, know that I close the doors in good order. The pots are clean. The casks are sound. I go inland to my sister in Grant's Pass. I do not expect to return. She closed the logbook gently. Then, because her father had taught her that a room, like a cask, sometimes hides a second chamber, she stood, and she began to tap her knuckles slowly along the wainscoting of the office. And halfway along the eastern wall, behind the glass-fronted cabinet, the sound changed, from a full close thud to a light, hollow talk. She moved the cabinet, patient as a cooper hunting a leak, and she found, set flush into the wainscoting, a panel joined so cleanly that only the mismatched grain of the oak betrayed it. She pressed it. It gave. Inside the compartment, on a shelf lined with waxed paper, lay 3 items. The first was a heavy canvas bag whose contents, when she loosed the drawstring, proved to be gold, 47 double eagles, 112 half eagles, and a small pouch of Mexican silver. For a total, when she counted it 3 times over the following 2 days to be sure, of $1,780 in coin. The second was a small parcel wrapped in oiled silk, which she opened to find a woman's silver locket on a fine chain, and inside the locket, on one side, a lock of dark hair, and on the other, in a tiny hand, the word Ingrid. The third was a letter, 4 pages, folded in thirds, and addressed on the outside in the same clipped hand as the logbook. To whomever finds this. She read it that night by the whale oil lamp with the compass on the desk beside her and the locket in her palm, and Captain Halvard's letter told her the whole of a life. He had come from Bergen in 1859 with his wife Ingrid and no children, had built the station board by board with a crew of Norwegians and Chinook men, had lost his 2 sons, Eric and Petter. In the wreck of the schooner Fair Wind off Cape Foulweather in the winter of 1874, had lost Ingrid to a wasting sickness in the spring of 1881. After my Ingrid was gone, he wrote, I understood at last that this station had never been a fortune to me but a discipline. A way of keeping the hours honest until I might be permitted to lay them down. I stayed because I did not know how to leave, and I saved this money, year upon year, out of a stubbornness I could not name, until I understood that I had been saving it for a stranger. I do not know who you are. I do not know when you will come. But I know that no one will find this compartment who has not first troubled to understand this building the way a cooper understands a cask or a mother understands a child. And I would rather leave what I have to such a person than to any of my scattered kin who never wrote to me while I lived. Take it, then, with my blessing, and do not merely spend it. Spend it as I would have wished to spend my life, in the patience and vision to find value in what everyone else has abandoned. She set the letter down. She placed the silver locket on the desk on one side of the brass compass, and her father's compass on the other, and she looked at them for a long time. One, she thought, had been a guide to the sea, the other was a reminder of a love that had outlasted its object. She decided, sitting there in a stranger's chair in a stranger's house that was no longer either, that she would not simply spend Captain Halvard's gift. She would earn the right to it, and she would honor it with a purpose. The plan came to her over 3 evenings at the oak desk with a fresh sheet of paper and one of Captain Halvard's dried nibs freshly split. The coast road ran through Halvard's Reach on its way south to Tillamook and north to Astoria, and the mail coaches, the prospectors headed inland for the small gold workings in the Coast Range. The timber cruisers, the itinerant preachers, and the occasional government surveyor all had to pass through the town and, at present, had nowhere to sleep but the loft above the feed store. She would convert the bunk room and the cooper's loft into a lodging house of 14 beds. She would keep the cooperage itself as a working shop. Because a country of ox carts and water barrels and pickle casks and salted fish kegs still needed a cooper more than it needed almost any other trade. And she would use the great kitchen with its cast iron range to feed both her guests and, on market days, the town. The station would earn its keep 3 ways at once, as her father had taught her a good machine ought to do. She rode into Tillamook in a borrowed wagon at the end of her 3rd week and spent $140 of Captain Halvard's gold on a careful list, 600 board feet of dry cedar, 2 kegs of cut nails, a keg of copper roofing tacks, 12 panes of glass in a straw-packed crate, 4 gallons of white lead paint, 2 gallons of linseed oil, a new draw knife, a set of coopering irons, and a small sheet iron parlor stove for the bunk room. The clerk at the lumber yard, who had heard about the girl at the Folly and had expected a fool, watched her check the grain of each cedar board with a thumbnail and revise his opinion without comment. When she loaded the wagon herself, tying the load down with a proper trucker's hitch her father had taught her one summer afternoon on a Nantucket wharf, he touched the brim of his hat as she left. Back at the station, she worked in the order her father would have approved. First she made the building weathertight. She stripped and re-shingled the leaking sections of the rendering house roof over 8 days. She caulked the seams of the south wall with oakum and pine tar until it smelled, she thought, exactly like the harbor cottage of her childhood. And she replaced 11 broken panes of glass with the new ones, glazing them with fresh linseed putty she rolled between her palms. Then she set about the bunk room. She scrubbed the plank floors with sand and lye until the grain came up pale and clean. She rebuilt the 8 iron cots with new rope lacing. She whitewashed the walls to a cool sea color, and she installed the small parlor stove with its stovepipe running true through the roof, sealed with a proper flashing. Then, at last, she set about the cooperage. She oiled the benches, she trued the shaving horse, she sharpened her father's old draw knife on a whetstone she found in a drawer. And she coopered her first barrel in Halvard's Reach, a 30-gallon water cask of white oak, in a single Saturday, and when she filled it and it did not weep so much as a bead. She sat down on the floor beside it and cried for the first time since her father had not come home. The first of the 3 came in the 2nd week of her rebuild, and his name was Bertramash, and he was a joiner 61 years old with a white mustache and a limp from a saw accident in his youth. And he came, he said, to see the fool girl at the Folly. He watched her hang a door for 20 minutes without speaking. Then produced a small brass plumb bob from his coat and set it against her jamb. "You're an 1/8 off at the top," he said. She looked, and she was. "Show me," she said. He did. 2 days later he came back with his own tool chest on a hand cart, and thereafter, for afternoons a week, Bertramash worked at her side without pay and without small talk, correcting her tenons and her dovetails until they were as tight as his own, and she understood, without either of them ever saying so, that he had once had a daughter and no longer did. The second was Mrs. Adelaide Carson, the baker's widow, 68, who lived alone above the bakery and who, on the morning after the whitewashing of the bunk room, appeared at the south doors with a covered basket containing a fresh loaf, half a pound of butter wrapped in a cabbage leaf, and a crock of blackberry preserves. "You cannot live on ship's biscuit, child," she said, and she set the basket on the coopering bench and left without waiting for thanks. The basket came, thereafter, 3 mornings a week, and Adelaide learned to leave a coopered pail of fresh spring water on Mrs. Carson's back step in exchange, and neither of them ever mentioned the arrangement. The third was Thomas Beck, 34, the town blacksmith, a broad quiet man with a burned patch on his left forearm, and he came, one Tuesday, because Mr. Folly had mentioned in his hearing that the girl at the Folly had spoken of relighting the try-works. He walked the length of the brick furnace with her, ran his palm along the pot rims, tapped the chimney damper, and said, "Your father's work. She had made no mention of her father to anyone in the town. "How did you know?" she asked. He shrugged. "The damper hinge is set for a right-handed man who worked at a station. Only 3 coopers on this coast said it that way. Elias Merrick was one of them." He looked at her for a long moment. "I apprenticed to a man who apprenticed to your father. I owe him a debt. I'll help you fire the pots when you're ready." These were not, Adelaide understood, friendships in the parlor sense her Aunt Martha in Boston would have recognized. They were something older and more useful, a community assembled slowly, plank by plank, by the shared discipline of work. Months turned into a year. By the following July, on the anniversary of the day she had counted out $412 onto Mr. Folly's desk, the Halvard Folly was gone, and in its place stood a long, low, white-painted building with a slate roof mended tight, blue-trimmed windows glazed clean. A broad porch across the south face where a pair of rocking chairs faced the sea, a hand-painted signboard above the great south doors reading, in Bertram Ashe's careful lettering, "The Halvard Station, Lodging, Cooperage, and Forge," and beneath it, in smaller script, A. Merrick, Proprietor. The bunk room slept 14, the kitchen fed 40 on market days, the cooperage turned out 12 casks and barrels a week, and the try-works, refired at last with Thomas Beck at the damper, rendered spring salmon oil for the coast trade because the whales, as Captain Halvard had known, were not coming back. The first guest signed the register on the 14th of July, a Methodist circuit rider on his way to Astoria. The second was a government surveyor mapping the coast for the new lighthouse service. The third was a Portland dry goods drummer with a case of samples and a fondness for Mrs. Carson's blackberry preserves. By the end of that first month, 29 travelers had slept beneath the slate roof, and the town, without having taken a formal vote on the matter, had begun to call her Miss Adelaide, or, more often, and with a grave little nod, Miss Merrick of the station. Her days took a shape as regular and as satisfying as a well-hooped cask. She rose at 5, lit the kitchen range, set the coffee, and stepped out onto the porch with her father's compass in her apron pocket to watch the sun come up over the spruce ridge behind the town. Mrs. Carson arrived at 6 with the day's bread and stayed to help serve breakfast to the guests. Bertram Ashe came at 8 and worked with her in the cooperage until noon, when the two of them ate cold ham and pickles at the coopering bench and argued gently about the proper bevel of a chime. Thomas Beck came at 3, when the forge fires at his own shop were banked, and worked the try-works with her through the long summer afternoons. And by dusk the smell of rendering salmon oil hung sweet and heavy over the strand. In the evenings she sat on the porch with whatever guests were staying and answered their questions about the coast and the tides. On Sundays she taught the coopering trade to 2 boys from the town, Anders Beck, who was Thomas's nephew, and a slight, quiet boy named Peter Halvard, 10 years old, who was, by the strange geometry of these small coasts, a great-nephew of the captain, and to whom she gave, at Christmas of that year, a small draw-knife of his own. The Halvard Station had become, without anyone quite deciding that it would, the social and economic heart of Halvard's Reach, the place where the mail was sorted, where contracts were signed, where the town's midsummer supper was held on the long porch, and where children on hot afternoons were allowed to sit in a pair of rocking chairs and drink cold spring water from a coopered pail. On a quiet evening in the second autumn, when the last guest had gone up to bed and the kitchen fire was banked and Mrs. Carson had left a covered plate of gingerbread on the range, Adelaide climbed the narrow stair off the cooperage loft to the room that had been Captain Halvard's office and was now her own. She had changed almost nothing in it. The great oak desk still stood beneath the window, the leather-backed captain's chair still waited. The wall panel she had opened on that first night was closed again, its mismatched grain now known to her as a friend's face is known. She sat down in the captain's chair, lit the whale oil lamp, and drew from the top drawer of the desk 2 objects that she kept always together there. She placed them on the blotter side by side. On the left she placed her father's brass sighting compass in its square of oiled sailcloth, its needle steady, its glass scratched, and it was, as it had always been, a guide to true north and to the elegant logic of a machine that a man's honest hands had kept. On the right she placed Captain Halvard's silver locket with its lock of Ingrid's dark hair, and it was, as it had become, a reminder that a life could be measured not by what it accumulated but by what it chose, at last, to give away. She sat looking at them for a while, and she thought, without any bitterness at all, of her Uncle Josiah Thorne on Beacon Hill, who was, she had heard through a Boston-bound drummer that summer, doing very well in the new firm and had recently added a second carriage. He had been, she understood now, neither cruel nor unkind. He had only been a man for whom the world was a ledger book of profit and loss. And in such a book a niece who read whaling schematics by candlelight was, quite reasonably, an entry that did not balance. He could not have imagined this room, this desk, this coast, this life. His ledger had no column for it. She wished him, quite honestly, well. She was Adelaide Merrick. She had been 20 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. She had spent $412 on a derelict whaling station at the end of a coast road 500 miles from another living soul who knew her name. And it was the best $412 she ever spent. It had bought her more than a home, it had bought her a life.